For 12 nights they were guests, fed and sheltered by the families of Glencoe. At 5 in the morning on the 13th day, they rose from their beds and murdered their hosts. 38 died before dawn, and the order that commanded it was written down, with 2 surnames on either side of it. That document survives. The name it was addressed to, Captain Robert Campbell of Glen. The name written inside it, marked for the sword, the MacDonalds of Glencoe. 1 page, a Campbell on one side of it, the MacDonalds on the other, and a single instruction between them: put all to the sword under 70. To understand how a government came to write that sentence, you have to go back 5 weeks to a snowstorm and a missed deadline. Here's what this film covers. The deadline missed by a handful of days that handed a government its excuse. 12 nights of hospitality with the killers already inside. What happened at 5 in the morning, and the crime so specific that Scots law keeps its own name for it. Then, at the end, what both surnames carry today, and how to tell whether your own family was in the Glen. Stay for that part even if you think you know this story. Every week we trace another name. If yours should be next, subscribe and drop it below. 5 weeks earlier, late in 1691, the government tried a different approach with the Highlands. Not the sword this time, a deadline and an offer. Every clan chief was to swear an oath of allegiance to King William before a magistrate by the 1st of January 1692. Swear it, and the old wars, the old loyalties to the exiled King James would be set aside. Sign, and the past disappears. Alastair MacIan, chief of the MacDonalds of Glencoe, did not sign. Not in November, not through most of December. His clan was small, poor, and already carried a name for cattle raiding, but like the other chiefs, he was waiting for the exiled king to release him from the oath he had already sworn. James signed that release in December. Word of it did not reach the Highlands until the 28th, 3 days before the deadline. MacIan rode for Fort William, assuming a soldier could take his oath. He was told no, only a civil sheriff could administer it, and the nearest one sat at Inverrary, 74 miles away through winter passes. The governor gave him a letter explaining the mistake, and MacIan went south into the snow. On the road, he was stopped by government grenadiers and held for a day. He reached Inverrary on the 2nd of January, the deadline already gone, and found the sheriff still away for the new year. He waited 3 more days. On the 6th of January, the oath was administered. Late, but sworn. The sheriff wrote to Fort William that he had received the great lost sheep Glencoe, and sent the certificate on to Edinburgh with a plea that it be honoured. In Edinburgh, it was not honoured. The record shows that Glencoe's name was scored off the certificate, struck through, blotted out, before the list ever reached the king. On the papers William saw, the MacDonalds of Glencoe stood as the one clan in Scotland that had simply refused. And in the fresh instructions that came north over the king's own signature, one phrase stood out. Not punish. Extirpate that sept of thieves. Root them out. The man pressing hardest, Secretary of State John Dalrymple, the Master of Stair, had argued for months that the Highlands needed a lesson, not another pardon. Now he had his paperwork. The man who seized on that late signature will come back at the end of this story, in front of an inquiry, with his name protected. Orders began moving north. Soldiers on the road toward Glencoe. In early February of 1692, the soldiers came down into Glencoe, roughly 120 of them from the Earl of Argyll's regiment of foot, on foot in winter cold, muskets and packs on their backs. Nothing in the manner of their arrival set that day apart from any other. Their captain was Robert Campbell of Glen, around 60 years old, a soldier most of his life, and by most accounts a ruined one, a gambler deep in debt, his estate all but gone. It is worth saying plainly what he was not. He commanded government troops, raised and paid by the crown. Some men in the ranks carried the Campbell name, as their captain did, but this was not a clan raiding party settling an old score. It was the king's soldiers in the king's coats carrying the king's orders. The reason given for their coming was ordinary, quartering against unpaid taxes, and under the old custom of Highland hospitality, that was reason enough. A traveller, even an armed one, was owed food, a fire and a bed under the roof he asked for. It was not a courtesy, it was closer to a law. So the Glen took them in. The soldiers were spread across its small townships, Invercoe, Inverriggan, Achnacon, Actriochtan. 2 or 3 men to a house, sleeping by the same hearths as the families who owned them, eating from the same pot. And Glenlyon was not lodging among strangers. His own niece was married to one of the chief's sons. Each morning, by custom, the captain took his first dram of the day at their table. For 12 nights, that was the whole of it. Peat smoke and shared meals, cards played by firelight late into the evening, whisky passed around a table that belonged to somebody else. On the evening of the 12th of February, Glenlyon sat late over cards with the chief's sons, and accepted an invitation to dine with old MacIan himself the following day. The story goes that the cards were barely cleared away when a soldier came up the Glen from the south, carrying a sealed order. By the time the Glen slept, it was in Glenlyon's hands. He had said yes to his host's table for the 13th of February, and now he knew what the 13th of February was to be. What that order said, you have already glimpsed. Return to the document. Its authority came down from Edinburgh, from instructions carrying the King's own signature, pressed forward by the Master of Stair, through the army's chain of command, until Major Robert Duncanson wrote the final order in his own hand, and sent it to the man already living inside the Glen, Robert Campbell of Glenlyon. One line carried all the weight. You are hereby ordered to fall upon the rebels, the MacDonalds of Glencoe, and put all to the sword under 70. Under 70 meant exactly what it said. Every male in the Glen below 70 years of age was to be killed. And near the foot of the page, one more line. This is by the King's special command, that these miscreants be cut off, root and branch. The plan had a precise shape. The killing was to begin, in the order's own words, at 5 of the clock precisely. 400 more soldiers were to close the mountain passes to the north, and 400 to come up the Glen from the south behind Glenlyon's companies. That night a blizzard came down off the mountains, and the companies meant to sail the Glen were held back by the snow. What followed took only minutes in each house. Soldiers who had eaten and slept as guests for the better part of a fortnight rose in the small hours and turned on their hosts. Old MacIan was shot beside his own bed as he rose, by a party under Lieutenant Lindsay, and tradition holds Lindsay was one of the officers who had accepted the invitation to dine with him that very day. Houses were set alight, cattle were driven off into the dark. The soldiers' own report counted 38 dead that morning. The families who survived counted about 25. Modern historians settle near 30. Nobody was counting carefully, and those who fled were beyond counting altogether. Into the storm, onto the open mountainside, in February with nothing. Tradition puts the number who died of the cold at around 40. Women, children, the old. No record was ever made. It was never anyone's task to make one. Not every soldier, the story has always insisted, had the stomach for it. 2 lieutenants, Francis Farquhar and Gilbert Kennedy, are said to have broken their swords rather than obey. What the record shows for certain is that both men later gave evidence to the inquiry, and tradition holds that in one house the night before, a soldier bent to pat his host's grey dog by the fire and said, loud enough to be heard, "Grey dog, if I were you, I would make my bed in the heather tonight." By first light the Glen stood empty. Smoke rose from the ruins of the houses, and the snow beneath it was no longer white. Scots law had a word for what happened between a guest and a host that morning. It was graver than an ordinary killing, and it had a name. The statute was already a century old. In 1587, Scots law had named the crime of killing those who had given you hospitality, or taken yours, slaughter under trust, and it did not class it as murder alone. It classed it as a kind of treason. A guest under your roof was safe, whatever old quarrel lay between your names. The law had simply written down what every household already knew. The story did not stay in the Glen. It travelled, through pamphlets, through opposition speeches, into the hands of men who wanted the government to fall. What had happened at 5 in the morning became a weapon, aimed at the ministers who had signed for it. By 1695, the pressure had forced a commission of inquiry, and then a vote of Parliament. The finding used the plainest word available: murder, committed under trust. The blame was laid chiefly on one man, John Dalrymple, Master of Stair, whose letters were found to have pushed beyond even the king's instructions. What the finding stepped carefully around was this: the king's own signature sat on those instructions. Stair lost his office. In time, he was made an earl. Glenlyon, Lindsay and the soldiers of the Glen were never brought to trial. Parliament asked for their prosecution, and the asking was as far as it went. And the man who had seized on a late signature sat before the inquiry with his name protected. The families of Glencoe had no such hearing. No signature was weighed for them. They were dead, and the dead do not get called to give account. What that night began settled instead into 2 surnames, and what those names carry today is where this story turns next. More than 300 years on, 2 surnames still carry the weight of that February morning. Neither carries it fairly. The men who came into Glencoe were soldiers of a government regiment, commanded on the ground by a Campbell officer with Campbells among the ranks. But the order came from the state, from a Secretary of State who wanted an example, and a king whose signature sat above his. This was not Clan Campbell against Clan MacDonald. It was the state wearing a clan's name. The name paid for it anyway. An inn in Glencoe keeps a sign at its door to this day: no hawkers or Campbells. It hangs half in jest now, but a joke that has lasted 300 years is never only a joke. The MacDonald name went the other way, scattered into the lowlands, onto ships, out across the Atlantic, carried today by families who may never have heard of the Glen at all. In Glencoe village, a granite cross stands above the river, raised in 1883 by a descendant of the Glen, and every 13th of February, for nearly a century now, people gather at it to remember. The dead of Glencoe never had a trial. They have an anniversary. This film opened with a promise that you could find your own family somewhere in this story. Here is how. MacDonald is only the surname most people know. The chiefs of the Glen carried their own style, MacIan, and that name survives in the spellings it drifted into: MacIan, McKean, and their kin. And one more family belongs to this story: Henderson. Tradition holds the Hendersons were pipers and armour bearers to the chiefs of Glencoe. One of them, Big Henderson of the Chanters, was old MacIan's own piper, and that Hendersons lived in that glen before the MacDonalds ever came to it. If any of those names sit in your family tree, this is not a story that happened to strangers. Drop your surname below, and we'll tell you if it appears in the Glen story. And if your own name doesn't sound Highland at all, Smith, Taylor, Wilson, stay with us. Next week's film is about how names exactly like those belong to the clans too. Whether you knew it or not, picture that Glen once more. Not the road the soldiers marched in on, the hearth inside one of those homes, a fire built up for guests who had eaten at that table for 12 nights running. That is what was broken on the 13th of February. It is why the story is still told at firesides. Only now, the fireside is a screen, and the listener may be 3,000 miles away. Every surname keeps its history. This was one page of yours, or of someone's you know. Subscribe, and we'll keep finding the rest of it.